Turning points change the course of our lives, whether it's a big decision, overcoming an obstacle or tragedy, or taking a leap of faith. These stories of inspiration and resilience are what Turning Point is all about. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of Turning Point. Today we are joined by Beth Beattie. She is Senior Legal Counsel for the Ontario Ministry of the Attorney General, where she specializes in health law. Now, Beth also lives with bipolar disorder, and while she hid this from her colleagues for years, there was a turning point that led to her sharing her story with the hope of helping others. Thank you so much for being here today, Beth.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
You know, the first time I heard your story was on Bell Let's Talk, and it really struck me. My fiance is a lawyer, and so I've spent a lot of time over the years with his colleagues, of course, and his friends who are lawyers. And this conversation about the stigma around mental health in the legal profession has come up quite a bit over that time. And I was just struck by your honesty and you know how openly you shared your story. But I did wonder, before you shared your story, did you ever experience that stigma?
I was afraid that I would. I don't actually think that I did experience stigma, but I was afraid that I was going to. And you're quite right about the legal profession. We're 4 times as likely to live with depression and anxiety as the general population. So even though it's rampant in our profession, people still, for the most part, remain silent. So it was quite unusual for me to disclose when I did.
Yeah, wow. 4 times, that's a pretty big,
that's huge.
That's a big number.
28% of us live with depression and 19% with anxiety.
Wow. So despite that fear of experiencing stigma, there was a turning point for you that led to you coming out and sharing your story. So what happened?
Yeah, so after 14 years of keeping my story a secret, I spoke with 2 women in my office in separate conversations. And one of them disclosed to me that her mother was living with severe anxiety and was an inpatient at CAMH, the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, the main psychiatric hospital in Toronto. And the other one told me that her daughter was an outpatient at that hospital dealing with anxiety and depression. And I heard their stories, and I just thought to myself that I could offer so much support and information that I just thought, Beth, just take the plunge and tell them and help them out. So that's what I did. And we ended up having wonderful conversations, and neither of them batted an eyelash. And since that was the beginning of my becoming really quite a vocal advocate for mental wellness, especially in the legal profession.
Wow. So these 2 women, you know, kind of tell you these stories, and not with any intention of trying to get you to share your own, of course, just confiding in you. But then you take it that step further and decide to share it more publicly. So what did that look like when you made that decision that you were going to do that?
Right. Well, it snowballed from there. I thought after those conversations, well, that was kind of fun and really invigorating and cathartic. So I thought that I would tell some other colleagues of mine, sort of my closest friends in the office. And I did. I told a few of them, and that went really, really well. So I then took the plunge and told my legal director, and she was wonderfully supportive about it. And then I did the hardest thing that I've ever done in my life, which was to make a presentation to my entire branch. And that's about 45 people, lawyers and staff. And I had a few weeks to lead up to it. And those few weeks, I had an upset stomach. I couldn't sleep properly. I had pangs of anxiety in my chest. I was just so anxious about making that presentation. But I was determined to do it, and I did it, and I got amazing support from my colleagues. They stood up and they gave me a standing ovation, and I burst into tears. And it was really quite a moment. And once I had the support of my colleagues, I knew that I could do anything. And that's when I really became a very vocal advocate.
You mentioned that this was 14 years after your diagnosis. So what was it like during that time, kind of having to hide all of this from your colleagues?
It was terrible. I really considered myself a condensed ball of angst to not be sharing my story. I didn't really appreciate it at the time how important it was to get that weight off of my shoulders. But once I did start talking, I realized, oh my goodness, I really was that condensed ball of angst. And I lived in sort of a darkness, and it wasn't my mood. My mood had been stable for many years, but I was just sort of in the shadow of things. I was living sort of a half truth. And then once I started talking, wow, it really was overwhelming in a wonderful way.
It's really beautiful to hear you tell this story about, about sharing with your colleagues. And of course, there would be anxiety and fear ahead of that. But the fact that it was so well received, they gave you this standing ovation. I'm sure, aside from you feeling relieved, a lot of them probably felt relieved too, because I'm sure, did you hear from them after, some of them who said they'd been hiding their own
Every
stories?
time I shared my story, I heard stories come back at me. Either my colleagues themselves were living with anxiety or depression, typically, or they had loved ones, family members, or friends who were living with some kind of mental health challenge. So I have heard at this point so many stories of people living with mental health issues. It's quite overwhelming. And again, in the legal profession, there's so many of us with these issues that I've heard countless stories.
At the time, I just want to kind of step back in time a little bit, because at the time that you were diagnosed, you were 35. You had a very busy, high-profile job, even at that time, as you do right now. So tell me about that time, about getting diagnosed and what led up to that moment for you.
Right, yes, you're right. I was 35 years old at the time of the diagnosis of the bipolar disorder. I had been diagnosed with a major depression 8 years before that, so I had some mental health challenges leading up to the bipolarity. What happened was that to make a long story short, my partner left me seemingly without any warning, and I stopped sleeping. And for me, if I combine an antidepressant with not sleeping, it can ramp up my mood into a hypomanic, a mild mania. But in this case, when I was 35, I had a full-on psychotic episode where I lost touch with reality, and I thought my father was God and my nephew was the second coming, or the Jesus Christ of the 21st century. And my family did not know what to do with me. I hadn't disclosed to them in the prior 8 years that I had a mental health issue, that I was living with depression. So they were really shocked when I started sounding so odd, like just saying these very odd things. They finally convinced me to go down to CAMH, and I was eventually admitted as an inpatient.
Wow. So that must have been incredibly scary for everyone.
For everyone. It was terrible for my family. They just didn't know what was going on. Interestingly, other family members and friends talk about how it brought my family together, that they really did rally around me and support me in addressing my mental health issue and get back onto the road to recovery. So there was a silver lining in all of that, but it was very hard on them at first.
So when you did go to CAMH, after your family encouraged you to do that, what was your time there like?
Well, it was a very interesting start to my time there because my brother took me down to the emergency department at 2 a.m, and we were led off to the side into a small room where I was to be seen by a psychiatrist. And my brother was getting really tired, so he said he was going to go find a coffee. So he left to go find a Tim Hortons. And after a few minutes, I heard this bang come from the emergency department area, and a woman's voice cry out, "I need a lawyer." And she said it again, "I need a lawyer." So I got up and I went around the corner.
Because of course you're a lawyer, so yeah, okay.
I just wanted to be helpful.
Yeah.
So there was a young woman sitting there with a trickle of blood coming down her forehead, and 2 police officers, one sitting on either side of her. And I announced, "I'm a lawyer. How may I help you?" Well, the officers stood up and they approached me, and some staff members came from behind, and they escorted me to another room where I was to be seen by a psychiatrist. And the universe at this point was telling me to approach the psychiatrist in a threatening manner. I wasn't meant to hurt her. The universe was telling me not to, but I was supposed to approach her as if I was going to, so I did. Well, there was a button on the wall, and she banged it, and a code white rang out, which means that there's a violent person. So all these staff members came from the surrounding area, and they grabbed me, kind of kicking and screaming, because the universe was telling me to resist. And they hauled me off to another room where there was a gurney, and they placed me on the gurney and put me in 4-point restraints and shot me full of antipsychotic medication. And then I lost consciousness.
Wow.
So that began a 2-week stay at the hospital. And it was extremely traumatizing to get the diagnoses.
I bet. Wow. You remember all of this so clearly. Do you feel like, is the memory like a dream, or do you actually remember the feeling of
I remember that part.
Yeah.
I remember all of that. Now, I don't really remember the first few days in hospital. It kind of all blurred together. I was, pretty sedated for a while to bring my mood down. But it was interesting because I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, but the second week I went to the office. And then, so I'd do my day job, and then I'd return to the hospital. They wanted to make sure I was taking my meds, getting enough sleep, responding well. So it's amazing how once you get the help that you need, you can turn it around really quite quickly.
Wow, yeah. I just assumed you were kind of in the hospital for that whole time.
No, I was there for a week, and then I was at the office working away, and no one knew. My boss, my father, had called her and said that I had a drug interaction, which he's a very ethical person,
Okay.
so I think that's as close as he could get to telling the truth without actually telling them that I had been hospitalized.
Wow.
In a psychiatric hospital.
And how, I can't imagine how hard it must have been to have experienced this and then to go back to work and to not be able to talk, or to not tell anyone, to not be able to talk about it. How was that?
It was very challenging. I was quite obsessed with the fact that I had this diagnosis. Like, I can remember sitting at my desk and I'd do a little bit of work, and then boom, it would strike me. I have bipolar disorder. I have a major mental illness. And then I'd work for a few minutes, and then boom, I have bipolar disorder. And that feeling, that like consistent thought pattern lasted for a very long time.
Those words, when you heard them the first time, did you had been in the hospital for about a week, I guess, when you got the formal diagnosis?
Yeah, I think they basically diagnosed me right away.
Right away,
yeah.
Okay. So did it take time? I know you're saying it kind of would hit you. Did it take time to kind of believe that that's what it was?
I think I probably was in denial for a while. Not to the point where I thought I didn't need medication. I think that's when people get into trouble, where they're in such denial that they think, well, I don't need the medication. I've taken my medication religiously for many years now. I never question it because it's kept me well for so long. But I think for a while there, I thought, well, I've heard of bipolar disorder, but I don't think that applies to me, because there was such stigma, and there continues to be stigma around bipolar disorder. And I just thought, no, is that really who I am? Because there's such stereotyping around us where we're seen to be unstable and unreliable. And I certainly didn't want to be seen that way as a lawyer. So I did have that internal struggle, not thinking that I looked the picture of someone with bipolar disorder, but it affects people across socioeconomic status, like education, all of that. I'm no one special by any stretch. I just thought, really, can I work as a lawyer with this diagnosis?
I think that for, I've read I read the article that you wrote in the Globe and Mail after you gave that presentation to your colleagues, and I think this is one aspect, what you just mentioned there about, that mental illness spans all walks of life, is something that really that I really took away from your writing as well. You make this very compelling, not argument, statement that this is something that can affect anyone, and I think I found it really comforting in a way to read you, as you wrote that, as somebody who, has a job in the legal profession, who, because I think that is part of the stigma, right? We think, oh, it only happens to certain kinds of people, and obviously it does not. So what kind of response have you received from, your article in the Globe and Mail, from speaking out on Bell Let's Talk, from people from maybe different walks of life?
Yeah, the support and positive feedback is just immeasurable. It's just been so wonderful. Out of all of the advocacy work that I've done, and I'm talking like I've presented to the majority of the top firms in Toronto. I've just probably made 60 presentations at this point, and I've only once received a negative comment. And that include the Globe and Mail. I got only positive feedback. So I'm really quite amazed by it. And I have to say that I have found such comfort because so many people have disclosed to me their mental illnesses. Either, not too many people with bipolarity, we're a little rare, but in terms of anxiety and depression, just to know that there's so many other people living with those conditions and working very productively. So I found that very comforting, and I've also really enjoyed that people have found comfort in my story. I just find that so incredibly satisfying because I had been so closeted for those 14 years, and I so wish that I had someone, a role model. I don't love describing myself as a role model, but if I had have heard stories of someone, like say a senior practicing lawyer who's living with some kind of mental health issue, it would have brought me such comfort and relief. So I like being able to play that role for other people.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it has given so many people hope in sharing their stories as well, and in knowing they're not alone, of course, too. I know your work now, that was the beginning, the presentation to your colleagues, the article in the Globe and Mail. As you mentioned, you've done more than 60 presentations since then, and your work continues to this day. You mentioned we had a phone call before this interview, and we talked about how your work now is really focused a lot on talking to people in leadership positions about the importance of sharing their experiences with mental health issues to help younger people. So tell me why that stood out to you as an area that was important to focus on.
Yeah, I think it's just the importance of role models. Had I, during those 14 years, been able to reach out to someone, whether a practicing lawyer or a teacher or basically some kind of professional, or not just a professional, but someone, it could have been people in a variety of jobs that were just successfully working. I think that's what it came down to. I just needed to be able to know that I could work successfully in my field. So what I've done is I wrote an article for Lexpert, which is the main legal publication for the business of law. And it's about why I think we need senior lawyers to disclose that they are living with mental health conditions, because we need those role models to break the ice for the younger people who are coming up. Because one thing, when you're living with depression, anxiety, bipolarity, is you feel so vulnerable. And if you know that there's someone in your firm, in your office, that you can go to get that comfort, then it's something that we really have to do. And we can't put that burden on young people at the beginning of their careers. It's just too much to ask of them, because they're so busy, trying to make a name for themselves. So they might feel that they stand out too much if they disclose. So we have to leave it to the more senior people to break that ice and to show that you can have a very successful career while living with a mental health issue.
I think that aspect is really important because, early in your career too, you feel really vulnerable, right? You're just trying to get to the next level and get that promotion, and the last thing you want is to give anyone any reason to think that you can't handle your workload or you can't, you're not fit to progress to that next level. So I think this idea of having role models, and as you say, like having people to look to say, oh, this person successfully works and they have a mental health disorder, it is really important for, first of all, that feeling like you can have a confidant, but also knowing that you too can progress to that level.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's interesting now because I do see more junior people starting to disclose, which I think is very encouraging. And wow, it takes real courage to do that. So I really admire them. One thing I'm involved with at the Ministry of the Attorney General is a group of us lawyers as well as staff who have lived mental health experience or who have cared for people with mental health issues. And we have come together and put on education programs. We've done sessions on anxiety, perfectionism, depression, suicide prevention. We now have over 25 people who are prepared to speak openly about their mental health issues. And it's mainly senior people, but a number of junior people and mid-level people as well. And I find that very encouraging. And we're like a support network for one another as well. Like we're just, because we've told one another our stories, it's just a wonderfully supportive group of people. And I would love to see more of that, like see it on Bay Street, see it in other professions. I think that there are opportunities out there to make that happen.
It's just incredible to hear this, after this kind of humble beginning of a presentation to your coworkers, how much this has turned into, how many people you've already helped. Another thing that kind of struck me as I was preparing for our interview was I looked at your LinkedIn profile. And you really chronicle all of your professional accomplishments right alongside all of your advocacy work, and it's very public, it's very open. And I thought, the first thing I thought was, wow, like it's really bold to put this out here. But what compelled you to do that? To really show these two things side by side?
Well, I credit my colleagues. Like I credit speaking to those two about the mental health issues the mom and the daughter were having, and then making that presentation to my colleagues, because they actually were partly behind my becoming an advocate, because they said, oh, well, you should go tell this person, or you should share your story with other branches, which I ended up doing. So it sort of snowballed, and I really enjoyed doing the advocacy work. And then I just got lucky enough to get involved in the Bell Let's Talk campaign. So I just think I'm proud of my profession. Like I'm proud to be a lawyer, because it takes quite a lot of education and so on, and I've been doing it for over 25 years now. But I'm more proud of making a difference in my profession by talking about something that's so prevalent amongst lawyers. So the two do sort of go hand in hand. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you're right, they do go hand in hand.
Yeah.
When I retire, I think I will look back on a great career, but I'll also look back with great fondness on having the opportunity to share my story with others and to know that I've brought some comfort to people.
Oh, you absolutely have. And, this really brings us like very much full circle and back to that turning point it was about, I think, 3.5 years ago now. So as you kind of reflect back, and I know you just mentioned kind of, retirement down the road, what is next for you in between, and what else do you hope to do?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I just want to keep telling my story, I think, is the bottom line. And I want to play a role. It's sort of teaching the teacher. I want to be a role model to other role models. like with the people that I described, the 25 people who are now talking at the Ministry of the Attorney General about lived mental health experience, all of them have become role models, and I want to be able to keep fostering that, like developing those people, not just within the Ministry of the Attorney General, but in schools, accounting firms, like just across the board, to be able to nurture enough people who are going to be become advocates themselves and real role models. Because it's not automatic. Like once people, they find out my story, it doesn't mean that they're going to disclose themselves. It might take quite a bit of time for them to get to the point where they feel comfortable enough to disclose. So yeah, I almost feel like I could take a little bit of a back seat now, because I know there's so many other people out there sharing stories and information and ideas.
It seems like a great next step and a way to make sure that this work not only continues but grows, and that the impact, is spread, as you said, spreads to other professions as well. Thank you so much for being here today, Beth. It was so wonderful chatting with you, hearing your story, especially now. I heard it a few years ago for the first time, and now to hear about what you've done since then, it's incredible, and we're really happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, and hopefully we'll have you on again sometime.
Sounds great.
For all of you watching and listening, thank you for joining us. You can find more episodes of Turning Point on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, more information about the show as well at priyasam.com. And I hope you will subscribe, of course, and join us again next time. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.